Hey everybody, it's Kairos. With MSI starting tomorrow, I wanted to take a deep dive and look at the junglers who will be shaping the meta for the tournament. I've tracked over 300 of their solo queue games so that we can analyze the picks that they're playing, which they'll be leaning on for the entirety of the tournament. Real quickly, I'd like to just talk about what makes a champion really good right now. And I think that there's a few things that will make picks better than other junglers in the current meta. One of those is flexibility, just the ability for a champion to go into multiple roles, especially when you look at Lee Sin actually being picked more in lane, it seems like, than in the jungle, but obviously the ability to go into the jungle, as well as Rumble, he can be flexed. And then also I saw in a few of LS's tier list of the Kindred being a flex pick as well, and so that's pretty big in terms of flexibility for different roles. Another thing that makes a champion valuable is a lack of counters. If there aren't very many champions that perform well against your jungle champion, that means you may only need one ban to make sure that you don't get counterpicked, which is super valuable, that it's not resource intensive in the draft. And also, if a champion is flexible, that allows you to pick it early in the draft because you aren't showing your hand, you aren't giving up a lot of information because you can still move that champion around as you need to. And so the value of these flexible champions is just really high, and we're seeing a lot of them in the top 8. And so I think this is going to make for a ton of super interesting drafts that are not decided until the last pick comes in. And then there's just a lot of shifting and a lot of kind of suspense around those, especially in best of one groups that we're coming into, that there will be a lot of cheese, a lot of interesting picks, because if you can just win one game, that is a huge difference maker. And so that's kind of what we're also going to keep in mind as we're working through just the raw stats of what these players are doing in solo queue. So for the past week or so, I've been tracking all of the solo queue games. I know that solo queue games aren't the same as scrims, but solo queue is where these players are going to go to practice new champs, get comfortable so that they can take them into scrims. We obviously can't see what they're playing in scrims because that's super private. They want to protect that secrecy, but then they're going to take those into the actual, best of one series coming up. And so I wanted to see if we can look at it and see what the meta is going to look like. So on the left here, we have all of the games categorized. So I logged all of this by hand. So it has the champion matchup that's going on, who played the champion, their KDA, the ratio at the end of the day, win-loss, what elo, the average elo of that game, and as well as the date. And so we're using that to pull in just a bunch of cool stats and just see what these games are going to look like starting tomorrow. I'm really excited to see what happens. By the way, if you haven't checked out my YouTube yet, I have that link up here, as well as at Twitter. I have an RP giveaway that is live right now, closing on the 20th, so get in on that. And also, if you want a copy of this to nerd out on your own, you can do File, make a copy, and you'll be able to edit all of the information as you go. So let's get into it. Here are the beginning of the stats. So here's the multi. I picked out the 6 kind of junglers that I thought were going to influence the meta the most in this coming up tournament. Elyoya wasn't really playing solo queue, at least not on that account, so he's not on this list. Up here, you just see kind of the basic player stats. So the stats of each of the players, the number of games played. Steel has the least, and then Wei and Solid Snake have been grinding out games. Most of them have a pretty good win rate, as you would expect. Obviously, Canyon at sitting pretty high, River, and then Steel is actually the highest win rate, which is pretty impressive. Then Solid Snake sitting close to 50%, which you would like to see that higher. And then the KDAs here, Canyon is the lowest. He was playing a lot of Graves, or he was the second lowest. Solid Snake was the lowest. And then River and Steel, both really impressive on the KDA front, in my opinion. And then here are the stats just by the champion. So you can see basically the champions that they're finding success on. So I highlighted some of the interesting stats that I find. You can look at this more in depth, pause the video if you want. So Viego's disabled, that's why he's highlighted in red down here, despite having a 4.17 KDA. So the most picked jungler over the past, the all of patch 11.9 is Rumble, 92 games. Almost double what Morgana has gotten in second place. And the win rate is 59%. These are high elo games, very competitive, and especially with MSI happening, the level of play on that server has to be a lot higher than it normally is in high elo, because there's a lot more pro players, and they're going to be running into each other a lot in solo queue. And the KDA on Rumble, 3.34, pretty decent, but the win rate is super high. And then Morgana has a sub 50% win rate, which is kind of surprising for how kind of strong of a pick she was towards the end of the season. And then all of 3 of these champs, Lee Sin, Kindred, and Nidalee, crazy high win rates. Again, this is a little bit inflated because it's solo queue and they're pro players. They're really, really good. But what sticks out to me is the Kindred win rate at 4.33. Crazy high crazy high KDA, and also just the win rate is insane at 76%. 21 wins, and I think that comes out to 6 losses or something like that. And then down here, Diana's at a 50% win rate. She's the 6th most picked here, but her KDA is the lowest of any of the top 8 champions at 2.05, just barely over 2 KDA. And so that's telling me that they're just dying a lot on this champion. And I think part of that probably has to do with the one-dimensional nature of her kit. She's basically go in and dive. There's not very many different ways to play her, and so it's a little bit predictable in those games that you know exactly what she's trying to do. And the rest of these champs are not as high pick rate, so we don't have a good sample size to draw from. Then down here we have win rates over time, and this, I thought it was going to be kind of cool just to see how win rates increase or decrease, and as well as play rates increase or decrease over the patch cycle. So as people are adjusting to these picks and seeing, learning how to play against them, then they are adjusting and maybe they aren't performing as well once people have more games against them throughout the patch. So Rumble was picked quite a bit the first 3 days, actually. He was picked a ton, over 50% winner all 3 days, and then his pick rate went down a little bit towards the tail end. And then there are these 2 days where he's sub 50% win rate, but then it kind of picks back up here. So I think that Rumble stayed fairly steady. He had this little dip here for 2 days, but then came back up more recently. And then Morgana here, she had a really bad day, the very last day before, coming up tomorrow on MSI. Play rate has been pretty steady for her for the most part. It was 11 games at the beginning, and then she was averaging about six games per day towards the end. Lee Sin has kind of been a staple. He had a really big spike this day, but again, steady win rates throughout here. But then the last 2 days, he was only picked twice between the 4th and the 5th, which is kind of interesting. Both losses, which as we get further and further, these champions are less and less played, so these numbers aren't as accurate because obviously you need a large sample size to draw any conclusions. Most of these aren't super worth looking at. Then down to matchup win rates. This is kind of where you look at when a professional player, when one of the 6 players that we're tracking plays this champion, one of these champions, what are the win rates like against the enemy? And so this kind of tells us how favorable that matchup is for the pick. So Rumble versus Diana, 75% win rate. So Diana's getting smacked by Rumble, which you can kind of expect. Rumble traditionally just does well into melee matchups. He has a lot of damage up close, and so that's to be expected. I mean, look at the Lee Sin, 89% win rate. I think that's indicative of the matchup. We have 9 games to look at, to pull in. Usually you don't want to draw conclusions, but Rumble is doing well against Lee Sin. He's also doing decent against Morgana. But then right here, Kindred. He is 1-4 against Kindred. That's not a huge sample size, but it makes sense. Kindred is really good at negating burst. She has her ultimate, and Rumble's whole kit is just burst damage. I mean, that's what he's doing to people right now. So Kindred can negate that, survive the initial burst, and then get DPS over time. And then one interesting one was Kha'Zix. That Kha'Zix, although he's not in the meta right now, had a decent win rate. I mean, it was 1-3. So Kha'Zix was kind of answering the Rumble power, because you think about burst, that if he can burst the Rumble before he gets to overheat, that's significant. And over here on Morgana, of her matchups against Diana, it was 1-3. That's not a huge sample size. Again, Fiddlesticks probably not going to be super relevant in this. And then I was hoping this would be a little bit cooler, a little bit more informative on what's going on. But then Lee Sin against Udyr, cool, I guess. Udyr obviously was not hardly picked. If we come back up here, 7 games over several hundred, that is not significant. So Udyr not seeing a lot of play. Hecarim is an obvious one, and then Karthus is one you thought could maybe make it in, and Lilia is just low because they don't play it in solo queue really. And Volibear also fallen off significantly, only 5 games played out of all of them. Then moving on over here to Kindred, when we look at those matchups, 3 games against Morgana. Cool. That's not a huge sample size. And then 3-1 against Lee Sin. Okay. That's not a huge sample size, but could be indicative of the matchup. And then Rumble, we just have the 1-0. So, and this only counts when the pro has played it in solo queue. So this isn't going to count if like somebody random in solo queue, like if a solo queue player picks Kindred into one of these guys Rumble, it's not going to pick up that because that's not who we're tracking. And then down here, we come to the player champion proficiency, which I think is probably the most interesting. It shows us where the players are putting their games and what they're playing, and basically how much success they're having on it. Starting off with Blabber here, what we see is that his Rumble win rate, even though it's most played, still only 50% compared to the average Rumble win rate is 59%, so he's lagging a little bit behind in that department, but his Lee Sin, very proficient, 83% compared to the average of 69%, so he's bringing up the average there, as well as Kindred. He's only picked that 3 times actually, but he's kind of known for that pick, and so you can expect him to be comfortable on it. Over here with Canyon, he put a good handful of games on Graves as well, but that's not showing up here in the top 6 champs. So 67%. He actually played Rumble less than anybody else. So that'll be interesting to see his comfort level on that, but he's an excellent jungler, and so you wouldn't expect him to have major problems. Lee Sin, just as you would expect, incredibly proficient on that champ, very comfortable there. More Nidalee games than I think anybody else. So he was playing a lot more Nidalee, 73% win rate. That's definitely a pick to watch for Canyon. Over here, River had a really solid win rate on the Rumble. He actually had the highest Rumble win rate of anybody, 67%, 12 games, looking pretty solid. Didn't play very much Diana, and we'll actually notice that not a lot of people did. Over here, Solid Snake, he's all in on the Rumble Morgana. That's a lot of games played, but Morgana, 41% win rate, kind of ties in with the average of that 46% win rate for her. And then the Rumble a little bit lower than average, unfortunately. And then what is interesting with Solid Snake is 0 Kindred games and 0 Diana games. So he is not really counting on those. Those aren't really in the pool as far as solo queue is concerned. So that'll be a big question mark around comfort. If he's not playing it much in solo queue, is he playing it in scrims? And down here with Steel, his Morgana win rate is really good. Compared to everybody else, he is bringing up the average significantly. 80% win rate. His Rumble is also good. But then similar to Solid Snake, we're seeing a lack of play on Kindred and Nidalee. He's not picking Kindred at all. Didn't pick Nidalee at all either. So he's all in on Rumble and Morgana. But those are 2 very strong picks. High comfort for Steel. And then finally, Wei over here, 0% on Morgana. Only 3 games played. Not a huge amount of games, but didn't win any of them. And only 1 game on the Lee Sin. But then he's better on the Kindred, pretty good on the Rumble. And Diana, he put more games than any of the other junglers onto Diana, but he still had a 50% win rate. So that's not what you would hope to get out of 8 games on a meta champion. You would hope that it would be higher than that for a pro play in solo queue, but only 50%. That's kind of telling of the spot that Diana is in. He played her the most, didn't get get great results, and then everybody else is just kind of ignoring Diana altogether. And now my hot take for best of ones that are coming up, I expect that Rumble is going to be pick or ban. And if they do let Rumble through, they are going to want to make sure that they pick up the Kindred. Kindred seems to be the best answer. And I think that we're going to kind of have a rock, paper, scissors that Kindred's counters, although she has a crazy win rate between pro players who are picking her. But traditionally, Udyr has been strong into Kindred, and he still is in the meta. He's still 71% win rate with not a ton of games, but he's still got a solid win rate despite a lack of volume. And then also, I think that Gragas could be a potential pickup as well. Gragas' interaction with the Kindred role of knocking her out of that is pretty solid as well. And then Lee Sin, I would have to actually go look at what Lee Sin did versus Kindred. There's only 1 game here, so I can't make a ton of inferences about that, but Lee Sin does have the kick also to get her out of her ultimate, so similar interaction to Gragas, but he is in a better spot right now, and there's more flex potential for him. So that's my hot take, is that we're going to see rock, paper, scissors with Rumble and Kindred, and then potentially Udyr. Yeah, I'm just going to say Udyr, that I think that he's going to stick around as long as Kindred is in the meta, and that she's a hotly contested pick. As a real quick disclaimer, I just want to let everybody know that I understand solo queue pick rates and win rates do not always reflect the viability of a champion in competitive. So I totally get that. I'm just trying to see what champions are more comfortable for the players, and Lily is a perfect example. She's not played in solo queue, very strong and competitive. I'm sure that we'll see her in the meta. Also, I know that the sample size is too small to draw a lot of conclusions. We only have about 300 games to analyze and draw from, which is just not sufficient from a statistical standpoint to draw conclusions, but I think that we can make some inferences about maybe some matchups and kind of what the jungle meta might shape up to look like. This is basically the full thing. I plan on potentially, if this video gets good responses, continuing the tracking process through solo queue and seeing how this develops. I'd really like to get a larger sample size. Right now, obviously it's 315 games. I would like to get that up so that the predictions can be more accurate and we can kind of get a better idea of what's really going on in solo queue and how those picks are shaking out. If you like this video, head over to Twitter. I'm going to be live tweeting through MSI. I'm going to be super engaged. I'm really excited about what's going on, especially in the jungle meta. As you can see, I made a whole spreadsheet for it. Go check me out on Twitter. I recently did a review of the rank 1 Hecarim in North America, Doanel, and it was great collaborating with him, and I'm really happy with how that video came out, so go check that out. I hope you enjoyed this video, and it can help you nail down some predictions and just feel like a boss when you know exactly what's coming out of the jungle at MSI. Thanks for watching to the end. I'll see you next time.